Greetings and welcome back, AP Stats students. We're going to look at 2014 number 1 about extracurricular activities. Again, this is a continuation of some notes. We've been looking at chapter 1 through 4, did some histograms, did some scatter plots. So in this video, we're going to look at categorical data. Notice we got a two-way table. Residential status is a categorical variable on and off campus. And level of participation, no activities, one activity, two or more activities, is a categorical variable. So this was the very first question, so you can imagine yourself opening the free response booklet and looking at this question, number 1. What would you do? How would you do? If you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to pause this video and see if you can answer this question without the assistance of this video. Alright, so the way that I'd like to do this video, rather than walking through step by step, I'd like to jump right to the scoring and look at some student responses. So for part A, the answer you should have gotten was 0.73-ish and 0.55-ish. For part B, we need a couple statements comparing on and off campus residents and how many activities. And then part C, you should have said failed to reject the null. We don't have evidence of an association between extracurricular activities for on and off campus students at this university. So I'd like to look at a couple example responses and talk about scoring. So numero uno, here's a student response. And they said for on-campus proportion, they added 17 plus 7, those are the people on campus who do one or two activities out of 33, so 24 out of 33 is 0.73. And then 25 plus 12 out of 67, that was 55%. To get an E, you have to show work and get the answer, and this student did both, so that would be an E. The statement is nice, but not required. See if this works so you can see my cursor. Oh, no, it didn't work. Anyway. Sorry, there we go, now we're back. Okay, and then, so they got an E on the first part. Let's read their response. For on-campus students, there's a larger proportion who participate in one activity than off-campus. So for on campus, there's a larger proportion who participate in one activity than off campus. Off-campus students have a larger proportion who do not participate. So off-campus have a larger proportion who do not participate, talking about that bar right there. The graph also reveals the proportion of those who participate in two or more are about the same. So those are about the same. This student has three comparative statements. They've mentioned on-campus and off-campus. And to get an E, you had to mention at least two of these three. So they actually mentioned all three. So this is a very good response. The last thing to look for is they were mentioning proportions or percentages. So you can look at your solution. Did you mention proportion and percentages? Basically this unit are percentages or proportions, not just the count of students. So this student got an E on that part. And then the last part we have, at a 5% level, the high p-value leads the administrator to fail to reject the null. Here's the comparison, high p-value compared to 5%. Reject the null that there's no association. We do not have enough evidence from the sample to conclude that there's an association in the context. So we have the p-value versus alpha is explicit. We have a statement about the null we are failing to reject. And we have evidence for the alternative in context, evidence for HA in context. So this would be scored an E. So this student who had an E on part A, an E on part B, and an E on part C gets a 4. All right, let's check out this next response. On part A, the student shows work and gets an answer. That's excellent. So they do these two divided by 33, so that is correct. And then they do this one and this one out of 67. Sadly, it was at least one extracurricular for those off campus. So this is incorrect. So this response would get a partial. On part B, the student says, students living off campus appear to be more likely to do one activity than none when compared to on-campus students. But both groups have nearly the same proportion of students doing 2 or more activities. So let's begin with what this response did well. This latter statement, both groups have nearly the same proportion of students doing 2 or more activities. So they're focusing on this part of the graph, and that is a good statement. However, the first statement is, I guess I could say it's unclear. The student might know the difference here, but they didn't communicate it well. So the students living off campus appear to be more likely to do one activity. Students living off campus, more likely to do one activity than none. Well, wait. Students living off campus appear to be more likely to do one activity than none. Well, I don't think I agree with that. It looks like one activity might be less likely than no activity. I think what the student's trying to say, maybe when you first read it, I know when I first read it, I think the student was trying to say, hey, look, they're more likely to do one activity compared to on-campus. Well, I guess I still am not clear exactly what the student's trying to say. More likely to do one activity than none when compared to on-campus. So on-campus is more likely to do one than off-campus. And off-campus is more likely to do none than on-campus. So whatever this statement is, it wasn't very clear, and it might not be entirely correct. So I guess I'm not really that convinced that the student knows what they're talking about. So this was scored a partial. They had one good statement, the other statement was unclear and they didn't have at least 2 of these 3. They got the 2 or more, but the none and the 1, they didn't salvage anything from that. So that would be a partial. And let's look at part C. The student responded, the typical alpha level of a significance test is 5%. Okay, so they chose 5%. You could choose any common, reasonable alpha level. 0.23 is substantially larger than that. Okay, so that's one of 3 things. So 1, 2, 3. They have compared alpha with the p level. Check. So the administrator should fail to reject the null. Okay, that's perfect. They have a comparison with the null. And conclude that there's no association between residential status and the level of participation in extracurricular activities among the students of the university. Did you notice what's missing there? This is kind of subtle, but really important. We do not conclude, it almost sounds like proof. We don't conclude that there's no association. There are such things as type 1 and type 2 errors, and we could have made a mistake. Maybe the data and the p-value has led us astray. Maybe there really isn't an association, or maybe there really is an association, we just didn't find it. So the problem here is here, concluding that there's no association. They should have said conclude something about evidence. Like we have convincing evidence of this or that. Now it's pretty nice. I like that the question didn't say, because a lot of times in statistics, the question itself will say, is there convincing evidence that blah, blah, blah. This doesn't do that, so you need to be aware that we're looking for evidence. Do we have convincing statistical evidence of an association? So the student did not get that part, so they would get a partial. So if I remember correctly, part A, they got a partial. They didn't calculate one of the proportions correctly. Part B, they got a partial. They only made one correct comparative statement. And part C, they got a partial because they did not mention that evidence. So this response would be scored a 2. And let's look at one last response. This last response, a lot of writing here, which is fine. They've counted total on campus and then they divided, so they have work shown and the proportion. There's no rounding rule, so they gave 5 decimal places, and that's fine. And then they have this proportion, 37 out of 67 is that answer, and that would be sufficient. Something that we didn't see that would be accepted is here's work shown, and it could be left like that still for full credit. So this part of the response would be scored an E. On part B now, this response says, there are more students that live off campus that do not participate in extracurricular activities than those who live on campus. So there are more students who live off campus, so they're trying to compare this right here. However, there are more off-campus students that participate in at least one than students who live on campus. So there are more students that live off campus that do not participate. Okay. However, there are more off-campus students that participate in at least one than students who live on campus. Is that true? It sounds like they're trying to compare the at least one. And they're saying the students that live off campus and participate in at least one, that's more than those who live on campus. That doesn't sound right. This percentage is, say, about, 75%. And then this bottom off-campus percentage is, let's see, that's 40, so maybe like 58%. So there's a problem there. This statement is not a true statement. So can they at least retrieve a partial out of this? There is a problem with this statement. The problem is we don't really know how many total students there are in the population, how many off-campus students and on-campus students. So to say that there are more students is not recognizing that these units are percentages or proportions. So you can imagine, say there's like 100 off-campus students and there's 10,000 on-campus students. You can't say that there are more students off campus that don't participate in extracurriculars. On campus, just by the sheer count, on campus would have way more that don't participate in any extracurriculars. So that's why it's important to mention these proportions or percentages. So because they didn't say maybe there's a higher proportion of students, they do not get credit for this part. So they got 0 out of 2 of the comparisons they needed to make, so this would be scored an I, incomplete. And let's look at their last response. So we're looking for 3 things. Why don't you pause this video, read the response, and see how many of those 3 things were they able to address. So first, based on the p-value of 0.23, the administrator should make the conclusion that there is a correlation between residential status and the level of participation in extracurricular activities among the students at the university. So first, they did not explicitly compare the p-value with the alpha level. And my dog is crying. Let me see what she needs. Okay, I'm back. She doesn't like rainy days, so she needed a little cuddle time. So based on the p-value of 0.23, there's no explicit comparison to the alpha level. They didn't even choose an alpha level. Alpha equals question mark. So they didn't get that component. They had no statement saying, are we rejecting the null hypothesis, or are we failing to reject? So far they got at most 1 out of 3. They're not going to get a partial out of this. And also, they decide that there is a correlation. A couple problems with this. They don't mention evidence. And correlation is something with scatter plots. association is the correct term to use. So correlation, you shouldn't refer to correlation when you have categorical data. I know kind of just how we speak, we interchange association and correlation, but I'd encourage you to make sure that you talk about association here. So really, this response didn't get any of those parts, so it would be an incomplete. So on part A, they got an E. On part B, they got an I. And part C, they got an I. So this was scored a 1. Thanks for watching this video.